Okay. So, so you want me to read?
And I said, "This is awesome. You're the future of journalism, and I'm going to take a picture of you and his."
One of the things I have on this is an increase in the number of people who actually listen.
Yes.
What we're going to do, the questions will come on paper or from the app, rather than from the floor, the mics, okay?
Are they streaming this one? Or?
This is streamed.
I started doing more of that stuff like this.
I do, and I really enjoy it. But there's no question it is a monster time. We'll discuss with some of the.
It's usually better to have them operate.
Yeah, no, part of the thing I really struggle with about it is that I do think it's one of the things which I so I wind up spending time on it that I don't spend, not even so much about reading it longer shows, but actually and
Good.
it's a trick because, I started doing it before there were a lot of members. So I really that is key. But there's no question that you give something up in terms of ability to think and
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. Delighted to be here. Yeah. Great.
They get a program, big crowds, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Hey, Heather. Haven't had a proper hello. Hey, I get Michael. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I feel like we're gonna have all these folks who are the number 6 Rob.
People. Good morning. Good morning. Hi, I'm John Griffin, the faculty director for the Conference on World Affairs. Thanks for being here this morning. Before this session begins, I want to take a moment to share with you why I work for the CWA and why I support the CWA financially as well. And one of the reasons I do those things is that the CWA makes such an important contribution to the civic life of this community, which is something I care personally about as a political scientist with Scott. I'm sure that many of you feel similarly about the value of CWA to Boulder and the Boulder community, so I hope you'll join me as a supporter of the conference. You've probably seen some of the posters around campus encouraging you to help CWA thrive. And as you leave today's panel, Our session producers, Bruce here is one of them, will have some donation envelopes for you to do just that. I hope that you'll give what you're able, and I hope that you enjoy today's session. Thank you.
How are you? Good morning. This is panel number 3111, entitled, Will Congress Ever Work Again? It's Wednesday, April 12th at 9 a.m. I'm Scott Adler. I'm professor of political science here at CU, as well as the director of the American Politics Research Lab. I also study Congress, along with many of our distinguished panelists. I'll briefly introduce them in a moment. They'll have an opportunity to make an opening statement, each of them, and then we will have them give a little bit of dialogue with one another, reactions to each other's statements, at which point we'll open up the session for your questions. We're going to do questions because it's such a big auditorium, and anyone in the back who wants to move down front, we encourage that as well. But such a big auditorium, of course. We're going to do questions in a couple of different ways. One is we're going to use the app for all of you who have the app on your phones. I'm told to read this statement about how to use the app, so if you'll indulge me just for a moment. In this session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system. Bruce has the note cards, the old-fashioned way, to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Live Q&A, and then insert your question. You may also raise your hand at any time to request a note card and pencil from Bruce, and he'll run around and try and get your questions from you. If you're a student, please note this in your question. Questioners who would like to verbalize their questions can note this in the text, include your name, and if I select your question, I will recognize you and ask you to read your question aloud, although I'm happy to read your question as well. Our four panelists all have long experience thinking about, dealing with, serving in Congress. Their longer bios are available in the program, so I will just very briefly hit some of the highlights for each. And I believe this is the order in which they're going to speak. Way down on the far end, hopefully would be a familiar face to many people in this room, Senator Tim Wirth. For many years, after leaving the Senate, was founding president of the United Nations Foundation. He was elected to Congress, if I'm not mistaken, in the class of Watergate babies. Yes, the group who were sent to Washington right after Nixon's resignation and really turned the place upside down, along with many other reformers who were there previously. Served for several terms from this congressional district and then was elected for a term in the Senate. Senator Wirth has plenty of experience on Capitol Hill and thinking about how Congress can perform and change. Janet Breslin Smith currently is president of Crosswinds Strategic Consulting, but served for many years as a senior staff member for Senator Leahy, and also served on the staff of the House Agriculture Committee, if I'm not mistaken. Senate Agriculture Committee. Heather Hurlburt is director of New Models of Policy Change at the New America Foundation. This is a group that's thinking about ways of changing politics today, and she is specifically thinking about ways to help Congress perform better, increase its capacity for thinking about and changing and updating policies. She's worked in a number of different capacities, both inside Congress and dealing with Congress, both for organizations in the United States and international organizations. And finally, Michael Frank, who is the director of the Washington, D.C. program of the Hoover Institution, has had several positions with senior members of the House of Representatives, in particular House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and previously with Dick Armey as well. So as you can see, these are people who come with loads of experience. We're going to start with Senator Wirth and move down the table. Senator Wirth.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's always a delight to be at the conference and to be in Boulder, and thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Scott, for your introduction. Let me just commend once again John and the CWA staff. I think they've done a terrific job of putting great legs underneath the conference again, and you guys deserve a tremendous vote of thanks. Let me, if I might, Scott, start where you started, which is I was the classic Watergate baby, 1974. I wouldn't have gotten elected had it not been for Watergate. At that year, 1974, there were 94 new members of Congress, and the year after, there were 55 more new members of Congress, which meant about a third of the the total caucus in the House of Representatives was new over about a 2+ year period of time. So what happened then and what do we learn from that? I'll be very brief on that because what problems we have now is what we ought to be focusing on. Then we were, in 1974, I think the country was going through another period, not as dense as this, but another period of significant chaos. You know, we just come out of the Vietnam War, the entrails of that were still around. The Civil Rights Movement, you know, had really made a huge impact in the country. We had riots in the streets, burning in Washington, and the impeachment of a president. It was about as chaotic a time as we've seen ever. Into that vacuum, a lot of young, mostly young, people from all across the country decided that they had to get involved in this. And they ran, not because there was a Democratic Party or a Republican Party saying, come on in and run and do this sort of thing, but because there were a whole series of young political entrepreneurs who put together their own campaigns, you know, gauged them to the districts in which they were representing, understood the problems that the country was facing, and, you know, by scores and scores of them got elected. Interesting parallel when from, at least from my perspective, hoping what happens today is that we're going to see now also a lot of new growth going in and running for Congress. So what are they going to face when they run for Congress? You know, I think we are at a point where if it was chaos in the 70s, it is really it's a very significant polarization today. You know, we're a perfect example of this in Boulder. We're probably the ultimate gated community in Boulder, Colorado. You know, you think about our, you know, separation from most of the rest of the country in terms of income, in terms of the pleasantness of the way in which we live, the environment, the education system, the healthcare capability. Largely, you know, this is a very, very privileged world and reflective of a number of places around the country that live with this same kind of privilege, or I would say it's gated America. You know, we're gated economically, we're gated in terms of health care and access to health care, we're gated educationally, we're gated financially. I mean, in so many different ways, there are sharp separations, and they are growing between people in all across the country. And the challenge of governing, and we can't say, will Congress ever work again, until we're willing to recognize the problems that a Congress has to deal with and recruit people to start to work on those problems. People in the country aren't going to have any faith that the government is going to do the job or any faith that Congress can ever work again unless people see that problems that are of concern to them are actually being addressed. What are we doing to make sure that the promise, say, of Obamacare expands more broadly and that we move toward more of a single-payer program, in my view, more of a single-payer program, more of a capacity to make sure that people can afford the health care that can be made available to them? What are we doing to make sure that young people have access to higher education? I mean, it's a scandal, the amount of money and debt that students are leaving school with. and the huge overhang of that debt, and the fact that, say, in Colorado now, the amount of money that the public spends on higher education, I think, 5 or 6% of the budget of the University of Colorado. I mean, that is scandalous. This is at a time when we ought to be doing just the opposite of investing in our own future. We're doing just the opposite, and the people who can pay, the paying customers are coming here. The people who are less capable of paying can't come here. That's another example of the gated nature of the world in which we live. So to answer the question, and I will stop there, I don't think we start by answering, will the Congress ever work again? We start by saying, is the country going to be willing to take on these yawning gaps which are growing bigger and bigger and bigger? If we're not able to do that, then I think we're in real trouble as a country. We're verging on that right now. However, it's not as if it's a mystery what we have to do. This is not a mystery. You know, it's a matter of organizing ourselves, and that's going to be, in large part, up to the best people jumping in and running, and that's going to be up to all of us to make sure we're doing everything we can to recruit those very good people to get in and run for office. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes, I am on. Well, it's great to be back here. As a lot of you know, my daughter went to CU, graduated a number of years ago. We love coming out to Boulder. And I think as I reflect on this topic, I may be the only optimistic person on this panel. It's probably true. You set out the challenges ahead. I want to do a little personal reflection and a case study of what it was like to work on the Hill when we did, in many, many cases, work together. But first, a little bit about me. I started working on Capitol Hill right out of graduate school from UCLA. I had come back as an intern for our Senator Alan Cranston. This is many years ago. And I fell in love with it. I was going to be an international law major. And I was going to go off that way into law and international things. And I went to Capitol Hill, and I got Potomac fever. I fell in love with the whole process. And I have to say, as some of you have seen me in other panels, I've lived in 2 countries that have a total absence of democracy. I lived in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship era, and I lived in Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy. So some would say, you know, I'm more than tolerant and sympathetic to our own challenges because I've seen what it's like when you live in a place where you have no representation. So I know that about me, that I absolutely respect and am in awe of this great experiment in this country. But I am concerned about the Congress. There's no question about it. I worked on the Hill from 75 to 92. And those of us who work for Senator Leahy stay in close contact with each other. So I feel like I've maintained kind of a distant eye on what's happened. And more than that, my daughter followed in my footsteps, and she worked for your congressman here, John Salazar, who was in the House of Representatives a number of years ago. And so she had the wonderful experience of campaigning for him out in Colorado and then being his legislative director eventually. And then after that, she worked for Mary Landrieu, a senator from Louisiana. So I can look at what her observations have been about the Congress, and especially the Senate, compared to my own. And I have to say, in terms of my concern, I put the things I've noticed the change in some harsh little relief, some little observations. One was a number of years ago when I was teaching at the National War College, I would take my students up to Capitol Hill to watch a congressional reception. So they would see, how do people approach their senator? How do they convey their ideas? And sometimes I'd take them up during Christmas time just to go to a Christmas party on the Hill. When I was working on the Hill, you know, on the Ag Committee, we did everything together. Republicans and Democrats alike would have a holiday party. I noticed around the late 90s, the parties were separated by party. And so the Republicans had their party, and then the Democrats were in a different place. And I thought, even in a holiday spirit, you can't come together. So it was like a little kind of sign. And then this year, in January, I was down in Washington, and I was at the swearing-in ceremonies for our new senator from New Hampshire, where I live now, Maggie Hassan. and for Senator Leahy, who was reelected. Usually, swearing-in day is like the first day of school. It's fun, it's a festival, you're going to all the receptions, you're meeting people, you're congratulating people. Vice President Biden was swearing people in, and it's usually a festive occasion. And I was in the Senate office building in Dirksen for the receptions, and the hallways were silent. Silent. There was no festivity, there was no going back and forth. You walked into a little reception for now Senator Hassan or for Senator Leahy. It was very somber. So I take note of that. Now, in the era that I worked on the Hill, and especially in the 80s, the thing I can say, and I have to preface it by saying I was working on agriculture issues and defense issues. Senator Leahy became chairman of the Agriculture Committee, and I went over from being his legislative director to the deputy staff director of the committee. Those two issues in particular give themselves to bipartisanship. One day I was really mad at Senator Helms about something, and I thought, let's just do away with the tobacco program. You know, he's from North Carolina, and was so difficult on some issue, and I started to talk to the ag economists about how could we actually do away with the tobacco program, and then quickly found out, of course, we grow tobacco in a number of states that have Democratic senators, and they did not want to do away with the tobacco program. So agriculture, you know, tends to flow across. In the 90 Farm Bill, we actually did come together to simplify programs. We reduced expenditures that had to be studied, and we cut out a lot of programs. But the real quick case study I want to share with you has to do with the Gramm-Rudman bill. And I want to talk about that because if there are students in this audience, I'm sure they have no idea what I'm talking about. It is a case study of what it took and how it worked to really get budget constraint, budget discipline. In 1985, in the early 80s, when President Reagan came into office, much like President Trump is doing now, there was a lot of inspirational talk, speechifying about two things: increasing defense spending and reducing taxes. And then the idea was that we would reduce spending and everything else across the budget, and so therefore we would have balanced budgets at some point. And of course, we all know that that's a difficult thing to do. We did increase the defense budget, we did decrease taxes during the Reagan era, but we didn't cut much of anything else because everyone has a program they love. Even Republicans, as I mentioned before, have ag subsidy programs, have education programs, cancer research that we all support. So as we were coming to a key deadline, which is the vote on the debt limit extension, always a difficult vote for the party in power, because it's so easy to criticize that vote. And as the Republicans were approaching this, and they were in the majority, they had to have something to explain why a member would vote to increase the debt even more, because our deficits indeed were starting to explode. We were not contracting, we were exploding in deficits during the Reagan years. And so Senator Rudman, a Republican from New Hampshire, and Hollings, a Democrat, came together with an idea, and that this idea of establishing discipline and a certain orientation to budgets was even supported by my senator, Senator Leahy, who's a liberal Democrat. And the idea is that we would give the authority and the responsibility to both the Budget Committee in the Senate and the individual committees themselves, so Ag Committee, from my point of view, that we would set targets and we would have to restrict and contract spending. It took 10 years, over 10 years. It actually worked that way. We were given a budget target. We had then to go to our own constituency and reduce subsidies. In my case, I had to work with the dairy community. It was a difficult thing to do. People were deeply upset with us, with me particularly, for doing that cut. But the idea, the genius behind this approach was we all knew that if we didn't make these individual cuts, Gramm-Rudman had a provision to say if you don't meet these targets as a government, a across-the-board 10% cut would happen to everyone, no matter what. And so that vision of shared pain, if we didn't act responsibly, everybody would be cut. Defense, cancer research, ag subsidies, everything. I'm not saying it didn't have problems. We tried to skirt the realities over time. We tried to weasel in our programs. But all I can say is at the end of those 10 years, we went from the largest budget deficits we had ever had in our country to, by the end of the Clinton era, we were running surpluses. So I just leave you with that. I'm not going to say we can't ignore the problems at hand, but I do want to offer this case study. When people say it never works, the Congress is deadlocked, we can't do anything, just know that there was a time, and maybe it's in my rosy memory now, but there was a time, and I can show the numbers. We went from deficit to surplus. Thanks so much.
Well, my answer to the question that forms the title of this panel is no, Congress is never going to work the way it did again. But once you can let go of that idea, then there's some reasons to be optimistic about ways Congress can work better for the American people than it has in recent years. But accepting that it's not going to look like it looked in the past is the first step in your 12-step road to recovery with Congress. If you'll allow me to be a little flip about a serious topic. And actually, I think I'll start right where Janet left off, because of course, it's not that many years since we had, again, a number of members in Congress say we have to get the deficit and the debt under control, and we're going to use the same mechanism that you described, and it'll be great, and we can do it. And of course, you had a rather different outcome in that we didn't get agreement, and you did have automatic across-the-board cuts. And so you actually succeeded in the same aim that you just enunciated, but in the sort of meat cleaver percentage cuts to every department that produced some rather, I can't really think of a better word than stupid, policy outcomes, regardless of what your view on the necessity of the cuts was, that nobody really would have done across-the-board cuts to the Defense Department, and certainly many of us wouldn't have done them to other departments. So that sort of forms an interesting bookend to the case study where you use the same method. It quote-unquote worked, but it worked very differently, and why is that? And I want to suggest a couple of things that have changed and that are not going to change back. And I want to pick up on something that Senator Wirth said to start with. One of the biggest changes in American politics over my lifetime, Scott will have the data to back me up on this, and I'm a Vietnam baby, is that the parties have sorted ideologically, very much as the senator said that we have sorted ideologically in our own lives, that Boulder is a blue community, and you like it that way. Tacoma Park, Maryland, where I live, is at least as blue a community. Michael is snickering. It's a nuclear-free zone, and we like it that way. There are similarly red communities that are that way because they like it, and we move to those communities because we like it. It's not something that someone else is doing to us. It's something that we're choosing for ourselves. Incidentally, the period of post-war America where the parties were very mixed up ideologically, where, as I said, I was a toddler, grew up on, this was my mother's milk. My father was working for Senator Charles Mathias, who was a very liberal Republican. That was very atypical in the history of parliamentary democracies. It was weird to have these big mixed up coalitional non-ideological parties where liberal Republicans were much more liberal than conservative Democrats. That's not something that we typically see. And so it's very unlikely that we're going to go back to that. And it was that kind of coalitional politics that made possible some of the great legislative achievements, or the ones that those of us who like activist legislatures see as great legislative achievements of the 60s and 70s. So that's not coming back. And just in case it wasn't totally clear, it's not fixing gerrymandering won't bring it back either, because we're still going to choose to live in these communities. And when you draw districts that look more logical, they're going to contain, Boulder is going to be an indigestible blue lump. I said that so Michael doesn't have to. So, and there's also some very interesting and perhaps distressing to many people social science research that members of Congress from safe districts don't have dramatically different voting patterns from members of Congress from competitive districts. That the pressure on you to vote with the party is pretty intense because frankly you can get primaried in a totally safe district. So that's another sort of sacred cow I thought I'd take a shot at. The second thing that has changed about how Congress works and how America works with Congress is who is able to get into Congress or get in front of Congress and ask Congress to consider their point of view. And a point I always like to make is that when sort of the days of the 60s and 70s that people tend to think of as the halcyon days of the modern Congress, people like Janet and me had a real hard time getting jobs in that Congress, much less getting elected to Congress, much less people who weren't white or weren't Christian. So that's my first sort of cautionary tale about the idea of the 60s and 70s Congress as a golden period in America. So, the positive side of what has happened in American politics in the last 50 years is that we have a much broader spectrum of the American public or set of interest groups and organized factions, as the Founding Fathers knew them, who think they have a right to have their views represented in Congress and who think that they have a right to see members of Congress voting according to their interest. Now, along with that development has also, of course, come the idea that it's not just individual citizens and groups who seized on the possibility of having their interests better represented before our legislators. And so this period also sees an explosion in the growth of paid lobbying and an explosion in how corporate entities as well as civic associations and private individuals think about putting time and energy into helping our members of Congress do their jobs. So that's another trend that has dramatically changed to whom and how a member of Congress is accountable, and that's another one that you're not gonna put back in the bottle. Growing with that, of course, we've had an exponential growth in the complexity, and I'd love to hear Senator Wirth talk about what came across your desk at the end of your time as a senator, or what comes across your desk when you're asked to give advice to your colleagues now, versus the complexity of the policy issues, which were plenty complex in the immediate post-Watergate era when it's not like they were simple in the 70s, but the degree of complexity and the massive flow of information which has led young congressional staffers to just be completely overwhelmed. You hear stories of people who are, so, as Janet said, Congress is a relational body. It thrives on interpersonal contact. But, I worked on the Hill in the 90s, and I have people say to me now, I'm so chained to my desk and my 600 emails I get a day that I actually don't know what my closest collaborators look like because we only communicate on email. And that's a dramatic change. And again, that's not something that happened because Congress is evil or Congress is stupid. That is a change in how our society works. And we haven't figured out how, well, in lots of areas of life. I mean, frankly, if you feel like you have your email inbox under control, put your hand up so we can interview you afterwards. So that is an area of American life that we haven't figured out how to do public policy effectively around, and it shows up in Congress. So then there's a couple of factors that could change, I think, to make Congress more effective than it is now. And I apologize, most of these are going to be nonpartisan. One of them is going to be very partisan. And I think we just need to recognize that we do have a significant faction in our politics that thinks Congress should do as little as possible. And so this isn't a bug, it's a feature. And that is something that I think we talk about gridlock in Congress as if, it fell from the sky. But we do have a subset of one party that wants to see Congress do little or nothing. I had a wonderful conversation with a lovely colleague about congressional capacity and the fact that many times there's not enough resources for staffers to get really smart on issues. And in this case, we were talking about national security, and he said to me, when all domestic policy gets returned to the states where it belongs, then we'll have plenty of capacity for national security. And I thought, well, that's not exactly what I had in mind. But this is a legitimate ideological struggle that has to be fought out, not among staffers on the Hill, but among us, the voters. And if you don't like the idea of a Congress that doesn't do stuff, then you might want to be involved in electing members of Congress who perceive their role more actively. If, on the other hand, you think Congress should do less and less, then your job is not to complain about Congress, your job is to complain about members of Congress. So again, back to a point that the senator made, that the problem with Congress is us. Second, a point that has also shifted dramatically since the 90s is the question of who sets the ideological tone, who are the party leaders. And after the 2012 election, some Republicans who were surprised that Mitt Romney lost and wanted to understand how commissioned a really wonderful study that in retrospect none of us paid enough attention to, except possibly the people running the Trump campaign. And they asked millennial Democrats and Republicans, who are your party leaders? And millennial Democrats said, oh, Barack Obama is our party leader, Nancy Pelosi is a party leader, Hillary Clinton is a party leader. Okay. Millennial Republicans, who are your party leaders? Television and talk radio figures. Now, I suspect if you ran that again, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren would get higher proportions from the Democrats than Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. So what does it mean when your party's agenda is being set not by the people who actually have to make the compromises to get legislation passed? What does it mean when the definition of what it is to be a good Republican is not set by the folks who also have the pressures of keeping the government open, and indeed is set by people who don't have to care whether the government stays open or not? And that has produced a dramatic change in what it is safe for an elected official to do. Because as an elected official, you're responsible to your voters, you're responsible to your party leadership, which has ways of punishing you or rewarding you if it wants to. But now you're also responsible to these other power centers, which have other means that aren't directly connected to the electoral process. So again, if you don't like that, you as citizens have choices and things you can do other than just sitting home and railing about Ann Coulter or whoever your least favorite media host is. And that brings me to the role of money in politics, which is another favorite thing that people like to blame for everything that's wrong with our politics. And I'll just point out here that you can't say whatever else you want to say about Donald Trump, you cannot say that he bought this election. So we really have to rethink some of our kind of easy pieties about the role of money in politics. Second, I happened to live this past year in the site of the most expensive congressional primary ever, where we had a Democratic challenger who was spending more money than the presidential candidates on the voters of one congressional district in suburban Washington, D.C. And the good news is he lost. And so I really take heart from that, in that you do now have smart candidates, and I don't think this is limited to the Democratic Party, who have figured out how to run against. I mean, look at Trump versus Jeb Bush, frankly. Money, I don't want to sound like I don't think money has a role, but I do think you now, for both better and worse, you see candidates who have figured out how to fight back against huge money dumps into a campaign, and that is something that I think you want to pay a lot of attention to. And finally, just on the money front, and this is really a specific Democratic point, although I'd love to hear from Michael if you see something parallel on the Republican side, but the rise of the small donor, both the Sanders, first the Obama campaign and then the Sanders campaign, and if you're watching now the Jon Ossoff campaign in Georgia's 6th district, which the guy's raised $8 million. The guy is 30 years old. He's running in a district that is normally Republican plus 30, and he's raised $7 or $8 million. That is not supposed to be possible. So there is reason to believe that money is not crippling our politics in quite the way quite the way that we thought it was. And now I want to come to my moment of hope and optimism, because I've thoroughly depressed you all now. So I've said that the parties are ideologically sorted and they're going to stay that way for some time, maybe forever, because, you know, we have a two-party system that is designed to make it very difficult to have anything other than a two-party system. And I think you've watched in both parties factions be tempted to leave the party and try to found a third party, and then go out and discover that founding a third party is really difficult in America. And our system is deliberately designed over the years to make it difficult, and if you are a moderately successful member of Congress, governor, spending 20 years to become Jill Stein does not look very appealing to you. So we're gonna see the two parties survive a while longer. But what we're also seeing is that Americans' ideologies don't line up with the party's ideologies very perfectly. So within both parties, you have really interesting sub-factions that disagree with other parts of their party on really crucial issues. And advertisement, you can come to my panel on the Democrats tomorrow morning, and we can talk about that as it pertains to the Democrats. I won't presume to opine on it for the Republicans, although if you push me in the Q&A, I might. But out of deference to Michael, I won't now. But you do have a range of areas, a really broad range of areas, from criminal justice reform to national security policy, and whether for what actions the government needs the consent of the Congress before it takes a military action, to some aspects of tax reform, to surveillance policy, where you have non-trivial portions of one party that have a faction of the other party that they agree with more than their own party's leadership. And in the last Congress, frankly, this is how we got sequester, because both party leaderships bet that the other party would never agree to cut the defense budget. But you had fiscal hawks on the right who have noticed that the Pentagon is a bureaucracy like other bureaucracies. And you had the anti-war left, which had been wanting to cut the Pentagon budget for years and was frustrated with Obama for not doing it faster. And they got together and cooperated across party lines in ways that are not supposed to be possible, and made sure there were never enough votes to override sequester on the defense budget. We got very close to having federal criminal justice reform legislation that grew out of right-left coalitions that were willing to buck the tough on crime factions in both parties. And I think that's going to be tougher now, but you will see that come back again. And you see it very strongly at the state level. So the future of a functional Congress is actually getting back to the days of an entrepreneurial Congress, where you have the ability on certain issues to carve out enough territory to buck your leadership, to buck the outside voices, or frankly, to use outside voices to leverage against your party leadership, which is what was done on criminal justice reform, and pass bills and make progress on issues. Now, that's not a panacea. That doesn't mean everything works well. There are still going to be big, important issues that are too polarized and too important to both parties to move. But if you want to see movement, it's in that kind of creativity and flexibility within the two-party system that you have to look.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be back. I agree with Heather more than I imagined on her sociological analysis of Congress. Let me take it a few more steps further and look at Congress more as an institution in the context of what we refer to as separation of powers ideas. And my argument is that one element of what's going on, in addition to many of the themes that Heather raised, is that Congress has systematically disarmed itself pretty much over the past 35, 40 years. And I'll give you a few numbers, and again, the whole point of separation of powers, if you go back to the Federalist Papers and Madison and so on, is to basically link, as one point a commentator says, link the power-seeking motives of public officials to the interests of their branches, wherever they reside, Senate, House, executive branch, or even the courts. And the idea would be some sort of an invisible hand, and don't forget, the Federalist Papers are written in the immediate aftermath of Wealth of Nations and so on, would arise, and you'd have ambition countering ambition. And that would result in a pushing off tyranny, pushing off accumulation of power in one place. And even talk about each branch as having a will of its own, like it's an organic being of some sort, and the Federalist Papers. So resources, let's take a look at that. And I had a chance to present this to a group of the newly elected House members at there's an annual or every 2 years orientation for newly elected members that Harvard JFK School does. Did you go to that, Senator? That must have been fun for your class in '74. Yeah, right. You've spoken to since then, right? And so I looked up a lot of the data just on the House was the easiest one for me to do, on resources and what they've been spending over time. But here's some of the numbers. First of all, the overall size and scope of the responsibilities has gone up, as you can imagine, since 1980. I took 1980 as my baseline and looked at that compared to 2016. Tax code is larger and more complicated. Trade agreements, same way. Anti-poverty programs, you name it. Almost every aspect of what the government does since 1980 has gotten more expansive, more complicated, and more in need of oversight on a regular basis. And having said that, in 1980, there were in the House, that's what I looked at, 1,991 professional committee staff. And these are the professionals, they're counsels, they're economists, they're really smart people who are basically become the experts in different areas within their committees of the jurisdictions within their committees. So if you're on the personal staff of a member, more often than not, if you really want to get a quick answer to something that's technical, you find the professional staff member whose jurisdiction that is, and they usually know it cold or they can lead you to the answer. And they're kind of like the intellectual Jedi warrior class on Capitol Hill, right? So they're 1,991 in 1980. In 2016, it was below 1,300, 1,298. And you start looking at individual committees. It's even more kind of revealing. So the House Ag Committee, your former cross-branch colleagues, were at 69 professional staff in 1980. Now they're down to 37. The ag programs have gotten somewhat more complicated. Appropriations Committee from 133 in 1980 to 119. Budget Committee from 96 to 44. Ed and Workforce Committee, 119 in 1980 to 63. Energy and Commerce from 156 to 109. One that jumps out at me is the Ways and Means Committee. So they have jurisdiction of the entire tax code, a lot of the anti-poverty programs like AFDC's successors, TANF and EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit. They have trade agreements under their jurisdiction. They have Medicare Part A, which is the hospital side of Medicare. And they went from 89 staff to 60. So they lost about a third of their numbers. Oddly enough, one committee that went up, and maybe appropriately so, is the Ethics Committee. Okay? Go figure, right? Also, when you look at it, the overall budget's down. The same number of staff at a House member's personal office has been stable from then to now, even though the average congressional district, about 200,000 more people. It's about 730 some odd thousand now on average. I think back then it was 525 or so. So you have the same number of caseworker staff, legislative staff devoted to dealing with the concerns and the communications from much larger universe of constituents. Salaries are down, not just for the members, but also for the staffers, and this Congressional Research Service, where I get all these numbers, breaks it out by category of staff as well. Members of Congress are interesting. The number of members of Congress who now sleep in their offices is off the charts. It used to be really odd and rare for a member. My first boss, second boss actually, Dick Armey, when he was the House Majority Leader, he slept on his couch in his personal office. And Kevin McCarthy, the current Majority Leader, does the same thing. It's expensive to be in D.C. It's expensive to have a second residents and all that. Salaries have pretty much been flat for, I think, over a decade now for the actual members. And I think it's something like, it's approaching 100 members who every night sleep in their offices. Some of them have inflatable mattresses. Some of them just sleep on a couch. They all use the gym in the morning, the shower. The ones who don't live in college-like situations with mattresses on the floor and 5 members to a small apartment. The odd thing is that the average legislative assistant lives a higher quality of life in D.C. than the average member of Congress, I think. It's just, there's something upside down about that. Yeah, and they're only there, as Janet points out, the week has been collapsed into, you get in Monday night, maybe Tuesday, and then you're leaving by Thursday afternoon. So you have a very short work week, it's condensed, there's stuff at night, receptions, and you just work really long hours, 2.5 or so days every week, then you go back to your district. So I guess that's a way of saying that I think, if you're trying to look at the role of this branch of government relative to the other branches, which have not suffered that kind of self-imposed constraints. And by the way, the reason they get that constraint is they asked for it. A lot of it happened after the 1994 election when the Republicans took over the House, in part because it was something they could control. If you're in the executive branch, a competitive branch, and the leaders of the Article 1 branch come to you and say, hey, we want to cut our budget by 12%, they're not going to suddenly get up on their high horse and say, well, you can't cut this part of government. They're going to, okay, you want to cut your resources, go right ahead and do that, And I think there's a lot of ripple effects from that long-term trend. For example, as Heather pointed out toward the end of her presentation, if you're a staffer and you're inundated with emails and more complexity in what you're being asked to do and questions to answer, you're going to be relying a whole lot more and a whole lot more instinctively on outside sources for information. Hence, think tanks and trade associations and consulting firms and law firms that have hired these people, they can be the shell answer man for the beleaguered staffer who now has a lot more kind of on their plate. You look at some of the other resources that they turn to. They have a Congressional Research Service and a Congressional Budget Office, but they tend to be very hierarchical in who they respond to. So if your member of Congress is not a leader, not a committee chair, it's harder to get actual work done and kind of to export that work to a place like the Congressional Research Service or the Budget Office, Joint Tax Committee, too. If you have a bill that requires a score on revenues, what it does to tax revenues, for example, good luck if you're not on the Ways and Means Committee in the House or the Finance Committee in the Senate. And even if you're on the committee, you pretty much better be higher up in the pecking order for the staff to have take the time to devote to that. So when you have that kind of degradation of resources, add to that something else that's gone on, which is in the administrative branch, the executive branch of government. There are so many more regulatory proceedings, so many more administrative proceedings. One commentator who wrote a book on this that was 1,200 pages long, on regulation and the direction of that, he observed that in the most recent year for which he had the data, there were 990,000 administrative court proceedings. Administrative judges and agencies would hear challenges to different actions by an agency. There were about 1/10 is that number, cases in federal district courts and circuit courts. So you had the average American citizen was 10 times more likely to have their rights litigated and resolved in the non-judicial branch of government. That's also the branch of government that writes the regulations that interpret the law, and they get to decide on it as well. Okay, so you kind of have all the three roles of government: legislative, executive, and judicial can collapse into one place, which, according to some, is the definition of tyranny. If you're in the Article 1 branch, you need resources to conduct oversight, to evaluate whether things are going as according to plan, and maybe to get more specific in the legislation you write. Have you ever heard of the Chevron doctrine, right? That's a judicial doctrine Supreme Court came up with that says that when Congress passes a law, we're going to defer to the expertise of the executive branch officials tasked to interpret that law when writing regulations. And there's a follow-up case that says we're going to defer to them on interpreting their interpretation of the language. So you basically have the courts pulling back from independently evaluating the black letter law and what it means and whether the actions of an administrative agency are consistent with that understanding. So you have, and Congress then increasingly is writing, they kind of punt. They write these very broad, non-specific laws that basically devolve a whole lot of executive branch discretion on how to interpret different terms of art. The Affordable Care Act is full of those, for example, and they were utilized very aggressively in the last administration, and they're going to be, I guess, de-utilized or utilized in a different way in the current administration, and it's because of the way Congress drafts this stuff. So I think I'll end there, but the main point in a way is when you look at all these different things going back and forth, just bear in mind that there is meant to be some semblance of balance between and among the branches, and when one branch sort of walks away from that, you end up with ripple effects from that decision serially over 3 decades or more that have the ramifications today. Thanks.
Thank you. So if any of the panelists want to respond, why don't we give a moment to that, and then we'll open it up to questions. If Bruce is walking around, raise your hand, and he'll try and get you with a piece of paper if you don't want to use the app. I've gotten many questions already, but go ahead.
I was very interested in Michael's conversation, and Michael, I think you ought to write a book related to how Newt Gingrich destroyed the House. Really, I mean, you talked about 1994, when Gingrich came in, there was a contract on America. When Gingrich came in, the structure of the House changed dramatically. You know, the committee structure, which had worked very well for about 30 years, of committees, subcommittees, and a dispersion of power and a growing amount of expertise among a lot of members, was absolutely destroyed, and all of that power was brought up to the Speaker's office. Oversight stopped almost entirely. Congressional travel, scheduling at home, Tip O'Neill used to have a rule of 3 weeks on, 1 week off. You were to be there Monday through Friday, 3 weeks a month, and you could be home doing all of your political things the other week. That drew people together. There weren't people sleeping in their offices. That drew families together. People were more likely to get to know each other. Part of it was the reason he did it was sociological, so they get to know each other. And none of that exists now. It's Tuesday to Thursday at best. The list goes on as to the information. Members don't have any independent information anymore. It used to be a series of study groups and so on. David Skaggs, congressman from Boulder, was the last chairman of the Democratic Study Group, which was a study group that provided information to all members of the House, Republican and Democrat, of what was going on the floor, what they had to know, what was happening in each committee. There is no now dispersed information anymore. All of this changed dramatically in 1994. And when Nancy became Speaker, she continued the same pattern of that kind of centralized power. So it's not something that was just Gingrich. You know, he broke the mold of what had been done before. She repeated it, you know, and that's what, and Buechner tried to do that, and now, you know, you watch the current Speaker trying to struggle his way through how to handle this very, very bulky Congress. But it's a very different structure, as you point out, but I don't know if anybody's ever done sort of pointed right at, you know, what did Gingrich do, why did he do it, how did he do it, and what were the implications for the next 25 years?
I think what he did when Gingrich was Speaker, he was acknowledging the importance of the freshman class to the new majority that none of us ever thought was possible in our lifetimes. It just seemed like that was a natural order of things for the Democrats to have not just control, but really, you know, firm control of the House. And so he was placing the freshman members on A committees. He was giving them all kinds of perks freshmen never would have gotten before. And part of that led to him creating these speakers' task forces, which denigrated the role and the power of the individual committees. And a lot of times the members who would be placed on these task forces may not have even been on the committee of jurisdiction. So you're right, and that there was a fundamental rethink of the role of committees and whether it was a conscious decision or not over time to take away the resources, that's what happened. Yeah, I agree with that.
Also, I just wanted to mention an observation about nothing ever stays the same, right? That we're always changing and evolving. And a fascinating thing is happening right now. In a friend of mine, good Republican friend, again, I have these Republican friends for all these years, so it wasn't just political expediency. We still talk to each other now. And she mentioned to me, ironically, that we actually have a third-party candidate who won the presidency, when you think of it that way. And so what I notice among my Republican friends now who worked in government for many years, some are still in government, they are as bemused, confused, chewing on what President Trump's ideology is. What is his intention? What does he want to do? And so I have this sense that in some respects, it's a good phenomena in that it's like a yeast. It's like a disruptive force within the Republican Party. Huh?
I said
Always
yeast
optimistic.
infection.
Huh? Yeast, well, Michael, it's words, not mine. But when I listen to my Republican friends muse over what's going on right now, there is as much internal ferment within that party in Congress over what do they stand for, what do their constituencies want, and obviously the combination of that plus this. When you live in a Twitter world, and I don't mean just the president tweeting himself, I'm talking about life on Twitter within the party politics structure plus the email phenomena. I've got 2 kids living in our house in DC who are looking for jobs on the Hill. One got a job. And yes, lovely young folks, young girls in this case. And it is true, this phenomena of, oh my God, we're working so hard, we can't come up for air. And that combination of internal focus right now, plus this disruption within the Republican Party, I don't know where this goes. I don't know where you think it goes. And Mike, I don't know if you see this. Do you feel that your long-term political colleagues are disrupted by this?
Yeah, and I'll put it in sort of demographic terms. If the districts, which I've studied a lot, are very much sorted by certain things. So the average Republican district has a lot more manufacturing employment, people who served in the military, people who are sort of in the middle levels of income, but fewer who are at the very top level and fewer who are at the very bottom level. Democratic districts have a lot more in the way of postgraduate degrees in their homes and that sort of thing. And it really does break out almost, the more of one factor you get present, the more likely that district is to be represented by a Republican. And I think the easy assumption that was made for a long time is that these members get elected, they've been elected 2, 3, 4, 5 terms, they go back to their districts, they're getting 75, 80% on election day, and they're voting 85, 95, 100% the conservative line on roll call votes. You attribute, well, if this district's 80% in favor of this member and this member is 100% conservative, the people in that district must be that way too. Well, along comes a guy who is basically challenging a lot of those concepts in the campaign rhetoric. He was, whether it was on trade, whether it was on, even some of the tax policy, whether it's on not touching entitlements. I mean, he had a whole range of things that kind of cut across Republican/conservative doctrine, and I think they're questioning, are our constituents liking this, or were they just, being anti-Hillary Clinton, or what was the reason why so many voted for Donald Trump? And they haven't figured it out yet, from what I can tell.
All right, thank you. I have many, many questions, so unfortunately we won't obviously get to them all, and some I'll try to condense or paraphrase. Let me start a bit where Janet left off, with the sort of Twitterverse, Facebook, instantaneous information. To what degree are we seeing what's going on the Hill as really of a reflection of what's going on in society? Though, that perhaps we actually are less tolerant of others, that you talked about the sort of demographic sorting. So perhaps that's actually what's going on, is that our Congress is looking like society as a whole.
I want to say two things about that. One is, again, there's not some fantasy past where we were more tolerant of each other. You're able to see it in public more, but it just isn't the case that there was some wonderful past where African Americans and the police, everything was awesome. So I think we're all more aware of it, and I think the fact that we're all more aware of the struggles that we have with each other, and again, that those of us who have maybe felt shut out in the past, whether that is Trump voters or whether that is Black Lives Matter, that those folks are able to have avenues to our attention that they didn't have in the past. That's a real factor. There's a wonderful anecdote, and I think it was maybe Senator Dodd at the end of his last term, you'll remember this, who said, I used to take the train home on a Friday afternoon, and I could get off the train, and I could go to the local Kiwanis Club on a Saturday morning and tell my constituents what was going on in Washington. Now, I fly home on a Friday night, and I am met in the airport by people who want to tell me what I did wrong. So a function of media in general is that there's much less space for reflection for everyone. And, I don't care what your ideology is, if you're sitting in Washington thinking, think of the video of Mitch McConnell having to be sneaked out the back of the airport to avoid crowds, I think the first week after the inauguration. That's gonna affect your choices.
Let me add one point on gerrymandering, which I think came up a little bit earlier too. That there has been a sorting along geographic lines, and a lot of it concentrates voters in one region or another. And when I was starting out in this field, there were debates about the proper kind of techniques to use for gerrymandering, and the Wall Street Journal used to run editorials with reproductions of some congressional district that looked like a really ugly ink blot, and there'd be contests to say, what does it look like, a bird or a dragon or whatever. And the point was that the districts didn't have any kind of geographical continuity or cultural. So in other words, a county might be split 5 ways or 2 ways, or Boulder might have 3 different members representing you guys depending on what street you live on, that kind of thing. And the argument was always compactness. You want to have the districts reflect historical, maybe county lines, the contours of a river or some other geographic feature. You don't necessarily want to have Boulder and maybe Grand Junction in the same congressional seat, that kind of thing, right? Well, today, if you were to get that change, I think what it would do is I think the actual gerrymandering that we decry in many ways because of the odd shapes is probably preventing even more separation. If we did the compactness, I think we'd get more deeply red and deeply blue constituencies because of the geographic mobility has been depicted in a lot of different things. For example, the Big Sort by Bill Bishop is probably the best version of that. People tend to, when they choose where to live, it may not be the conscious reason up front, but it becomes the de facto one. The places they like to live tend to have political homogeneity that fits their own view. I'm an exception, right? But I like DC. But I think if you were to suddenly go back to that kind of notion that was prevalent 30 or 40 years ago, that what proper gerrymandering should look like, you'd end up probably even exacerbating what we have today.
But also, before we get too depressed about this, keep in mind the founders kind of assumed this. So the reason why we have senators is that you're representing the entire state, and the founders kind of assumed local interests would be reflected in the House. So that there's something too. I love the Constitution, and I think there are structures within the mechanism that we need to respect and obviously learn about. I believe in civics education.
Well, but the founders, there's a grotesqueness in the population difference between Wyoming and California that is much more, the founders knew perfectly well what they were doing with the Senate, and they had no problem with that population differential, and they were very happy to use it to disenfranchise the urban rabble. But the level, just the extremes to which we have now gone in terms of how many people a Wyoming senator, how many people John Barrasso represents and how many people Dianne Feinstein represents, at a certain point, you do have to. I mean, I am not someone who thinks that fixing the Constitution is an answer for anything, because I think A, it's almost impossible to do, and B, if you opened it up, what you'd get is highly likely to be much worse than what you thought you were getting. But I also don't, I'm not sure that the Senate's check is in that sense a net plus.
I still love it. But the other comment I have to make, and this does support something Heather said in the beginning. The first time I came to this conference, I don't know if you remember something I said, which was for everybody in Boulder, go to Colorado Springs. The idea of us talking to each other, I do notice that among my friendship circle, we are unusual in that we are bipartisan. And I noticed it a lot we live in New Hampshire. We have a primary in New Hampshire, so there's a lot of political activity up there. My best friend worked for Rudman when I worked for Leahy. We have always had a agreement that we would support each other's political efforts. If I do something at my house, she'll come, same thing. She supported Rubio. And so I came over. I helped her bring coffee to her little backyard event. This is what New Hampshire's all about, primary, grassroots politics. Because I did that, my name was on an email, and I began to get Rubio stuff. And so they invited me to some bigger event with Rubio, and I called back to RSVP, and I said, oh, thank you so much, but actually I'm a Democrat. I'm just helping my friend. And then he said, we've heard of you. I'm the only person in New Hampshire that goes back, helps on both sides, because I do believe in the political process. So yeah, it hasn't always been this way.
So with respect to speaking to others across the aisle, Newt Gingrich was brought up. And one of the questions roughly was, has the party not in control of the White House fundamentally changed its philosophy of moving toward pure obstruction rather than some sort of bargaining? Now, even thinking back to Newt Gingrich, right, welfare reform occurred between Clinton and a Republican Congress. But are we seeing something that's really fundamentally different about how the party outside of the White House is approaching governing?
Well, we certainly saw that with Mitch McConnell when Obama came in, and McConnell said, I'm going to stand in the way of everything, and he did that for 8 years and did that very effectively. I don't think anybody's done that for a long period of time, and it's worthwhile trying to understand how it was that he got away with it, where was the outrage, what were people thinking about. But I don't think that's a necessary condition of where we are today. I know what Gingrich did in terms of destroying the House as a governing function, the way it had been. He centralized power, and he had a tremendous amount of power, but that didn't mean he wasn't interested in governing. I think Newt Gingrich was interested in governing. He had an honest set of questions. They may not be shared 100% by me, but at least he was really trying. He was an interesting, intellectually and conceptually interested in the process of governing. So, and Nancy Pelosi obviously was too. So I don't think it's the structure of the party. I think it has much to the way that's set up. I think it has to do with the leadership, and I think we now have in Mitch McConnell somebody who's got a certain cachet or a certain responsibility from his caucus. I don't understand it, and a lot of these guys just don't want to govern. I mean, they just don't want to do it, and I think that that's a dominant part of his caucus. I don't think that's a function of a fault in the Congress.
The only thing I'd suggest differently what you just said, Senator, is the people who don't want to govern have leverage only when they're aligned with all the Democrats. So within the 240 or so House Republicans, you're looking at 25 or so. You need 22 to side with all the Democrats to get to 218. So I think the vast majority, probably over 200, would like to, but they're being prevented by that group, which is kind of like its own party almost at this point.
Or they could decide to go a different route and not to have every single piece of legislation has to be passed just with Republican votes. I mean, look at the absurdity of the last healthcare operation, came right out of the Speaker's operation, done in a couple of weeks. That wasn't something that membership had something to do with. That wasn't anything that you built a constituency around. And that wouldn't have happened Wouldn't have happened even under Gingrich. I don't think there would have been a real attempt to get Republicans and Democrats, because then you get something that's going to pass. If you want to have something that passes, if you're interested actually in governing, I think a lot of this was not an interest in governing. I think it was an interest in sort of putting the political check up and saying we did that, whatever it was, something in reform and replace or whatever it was, and then go on to the next thing. I don't think that was a serious issue of governance.
My personal experience when those moments came is that when you tried to usually go to Steny Hoyer to find how many Democrats could come on board something, what do they need to change in the bill to get their support, and inevitably what they would ask for would then alienate an even larger group of Republicans, so you never could get a majority of 218.
Yeah, but you don't start with your own hardcore. You start by saying, what do the Republicans want, what do the Democrats want? You start with a very different set of assumptions about what you're trying to achieve. Now, is that possible in this day and age? That's an interesting question.
And that's my point. When that kind of stuff was tried, you found that you could get your number maybe up to 200. You couldn't get to the majority level, and this just in the House. And I think
on the House,
yeah.
I don't know if if the Speaker had gone back to Obamacare and looked at 4 or 5 serious problems in Obamacare, gone to the Democratic leadership and said, let's together try to solve these, my hunch is that you would have rapidly come to a bill that might have gotten 100 Democratic votes and 130 Republican votes and become law. But the Republican Speaker felt that he could not do that and hold on to his job. He gets too much criticism for working with Democrats. Well, that's a...
Yeah. Well, Heather and I were talking about this on the way over here, that a lot of things have become ideological that didn't used to be. And I think what your example is the ideal if we could make it work. The reality tended to be that the things that were on the table were viewed as ideological areas of radioactive danger, So either party couldn't take certain things the other party said they had to have. And then you can get some agreement very reluctantly, but you never could get that magic number. And that was the hard part. And it wasn't just healthcare, it was a lot of issues. And I think the problem, of course, is we've turned a lot of different issues that used to be more mundane into big ideological battles.
It's called leadership.
Yeah, I don't
So,
know. Just for fun, I give the House Republican leadership credit that it is accurately reflecting what it is hearing from various pieces of its base. And I think this goes back to, Michael, what you were talking about before, that, and I think the Democrats' day will come on this, by the way, and it's been postponed by the crazy in the Republican Party, so we haven't seen it yet. But the party leadership really isn't sure at bottom where the party is and what they can construct a majority around. And when you feel that you have lost that sense, then you can't ever afford to let any sub-chunk of the party go. So you're always, your leadership becomes, rather than leading in a sort of a way that we like to think of it, your leadership is just keeping everybody together enough to make it through the next vote, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, and somehow the debacle that happened on Trump Care counts as making it through the vote, I guess, by not having the vote. But that it's not the case that, sort of Paul Ryan is uniquely bad in the history of House speakers. It is the case that Paul Ryan is trying to hold together this coalition that is in some ways fundamentally at odds with itself, and that on some issues, its divisions with itself are greater than its divisions with at least some Democrats. So, and then this, I think, goes back to the idea that you have chunks of the party who can be punished worse by Ann Coulter than they can by Paul Ryan. And as long as that's the case, then Paul Ryan ultimately, he doesn't have the tools he needs to lead properly. And then you can ask the question, what does a real leader do in that circumstance? But
the House used to be an incredible amount of fun in the following way. There'd be a series of issues that came up, whether it was infrastructure, or healthcare, or education, or nuclear freeze, and a coalition would get formed. It was like a posse. You'd get together with, 20 members from your side and 15 members from the other side. You'd saddle up and you'd head off over the ridge and go after that problem. And, you know, the next week, there'd be a different problem up. You'd have a different posse, you'd have a different group, and go after it. That was the accustomed way of doing business. And you couldn't get something to the floor unless it had been through some kind of a filter like that. That's a very different way of thinking than what's happened with the centralization of all this power in one man and one office only. I mean, Nancy did the same thing. I think it's a great shame, and it's a loss. It's a real loss of the idea of us being a republic representative of states all across the country and not just, you know, a narrow kind of a focus. But, you know, is that going to change? Well, we can come back. That's another subject.
But I mean, again, I don't want to sound naive about all this, but that does, what you just said, reflects the way I remember doing my work. So we had an issue of whatever it was, nutrition problems for kids at school, ag subsidies, foreign aid, war, whatever the issue is in the Senate. But nonetheless, we approached it as, this is a problem. Can we put together a bipartisan coalition to address that problem? Again, I don't want to be romantic about it. It isn't as if we agreed on everything. We did not. My friends who work for Helms, I do not agree with a lot of their political positions. But our focus was on solving the problem. So BRAC is another good example, the base race realignment, whatever that was called, the base restructuring and closing down bases we didn't need anymore. That's hard to do. A base is an economic source of support for a local community, and some of our military, we love our bases. And yet, some bases just weren't needed anymore, that we had restructured our military, we had modernized our military. We worked together to find a mechanism to allow members to agree on a number of closings simultaneously, and we set up a structure to make it politically viable to do. And I have to make a brief case for the role of pork. In an appropriation bill, when you can say, I fought and I got this new research center, earmarks. We used to call it the oil that made the mechanism work. All members want to come home and show, I care for you. I care for Colorado. I care for Boulder. And one way I show you that I care is that I'm bringing money to start up a new research center. And there were abuses to this, and I'm not calling for let's go back willy-nilly and do this, but with openness and reporting and some kind of oversight of this activity, when it got out of control and we did away with earmarks altogether in appropriations. In other words, that process where a member could put in a bill, I want this money to go here, an earmark is what we called it. We did away with that. And I remember talking to Mark Hatfield, who was a Republican senator from Oregon, lovely man. And he fought Nixon on the war in Vietnam. And Oregon at the time had a pretty strong Republican, constituency, and they supported President Nixon. And I remember interviewing him and saying, how did you pull this off? Because he was reelected. How did you pull this off, going against your party, your own constituency that were Republicans? And he said, well, I had this combination of all the things I had done for Oregon. And so people could evaluate and balance things they agreed with me on, things they didn't agree with me on, but they knew I cared. So I think we need to reconsider the idea of earmarks with limitations that members need. We're all human here. Everyone does love the country. Everyone would like our government to succeed. I don't know any members who say, hey, listen, the Constitution era is over. We don't need this system anymore. Let's go to a more authority structure with efficiency. I don't hear that. But the issue is, are we stuck now in patterns that it's hard to break?
As you can see, our panelists did not have very much to say on the topic. We are beyond out of time, and I apologize for not getting to the loads of questions you had. So let's thank our four panelists.